Welcome to Relative Our Family Mess. This is the ultimate space where we dive deep into the raw power, dramatic perspectives, and compelling stories that define a man's true character. If you are looking for bold breakthroughs and high-octane energy, you have come to the right place. I welcome you to today's brand new video. My name is Frank Callahan. I am 65 years old, a retired Chicago Police Department detective. And last Christmas Eve, I stood on the front porch of my home on Lincoln Park with blood on my sleeve, snow falling into my collar, and a smile on my face that I couldn't have stopped even if I'd wanted to. The blood wasn't mine. Let me back up. 30 years on the force teaches you things that no classroom ever could. It teaches you that people are rarely what they present themselves to be. It teaches you that the truth almost never arrives loudly. It arrives quietly, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, tucked inside a jacket pocket or hiding behind a pleasant smile at a dinner table. It teaches you that the most dangerous people in any room are almost never the ones who look dangerous. And it teaches you one thing above everything else. The one lesson that never failed me in 30 years of working the streets of this city, and then another 8 running the organized financial crimes unit out of the District 3 headquarters on Belmont Avenue. The guilty always make the first move. They can't help it. Greed is patient up to a point, and then it isn't. Desperation has a shelf life, and when that shelf life expires, people stop being careful and start being stupid. I had been counting on exactly that on the night of December 24th. The house behind me, the one I was standing in front of on that porch, is a 3-story brownstone on the north side of Lincoln Park. Patricia and I bought it 31 years ago for a price that seemed impossible at the time, and that would stripping wallpaper in the upstairs hallway, while I rebuilt the back porch with lumber I'd hauled from a salvage yard in Bridgeport. We raised Ryan in that house. We buried Patricia's mother from that house. We celebrated 30 Christmases inside those walls, and every single one of them smelled like the roast beef and apple pie that Patricia made from scratch every year without fail, starting at 6 in the morning and not stopping until the table was set and the candles were lit. Patricia passed away 2 years ago, on a Tuesday in February, which felt exactly as wrong as it sounds. She was 62 years old, and she deserved 100 more years in that house and in this world. And the fact that she didn't get them is the one thing in my life that I have never fully made peace with. I don't expect to. What I do know is that the house is hers as much as it is mine. The garden she planted along the south fence. The kitchen she redesigned twice until it felt right. The reading chair by the front window, where she spent every Sunday morning with a book and a cup of coffee, and the particular expression of quiet contentment that I would give anything on this earth to see one more time. That house is Patricia, and on the night of December 24th, someone made the catastrophic mistake of trying to take it. I had known it was coming for 8 weeks. I had been watching and waiting and building. And the night I was standing on that porch in the snow, everything I had built was complete. Every piece was in place. Every door was locked that needed to be locked. And every door was open that I needed to stay open. The cameras were running. The recordings were clean. The people I trusted were exactly where I needed them to be. And inside my house, 2 people who had spent the better part of 2 months planning to steal the last thing my wife and I had built together were sitting in a pair of Chicago Police Department detectives' handcuffs, and not enjoying it even a little bit. I looked out at Lincoln Park and watched the snow come down under the streetlights. It was the kind of snow that Chicago does right. Slow and heavy and without apology. The kind that makes the whole city go quiet and soft for a few hours, and almost makes you forget what it's capable of the rest of the year. It was, objectively speaking, a perfect Christmas Eve. 30 years as a cop, 8 years running financial crimes. And tonight was the cleanest piece of work I had ever been part of. But I'm getting ahead of myself. If you want to understand what happened on that porch, you need to understand what happened 8 weeks before it. You need to understand a phone call and a jacket, and a name I had never heard before that turned out to belong to a man who had done to 14 other families exactly what he had planned to do to mine. You need to understand my son Ryan, and what was done to him, and why I chose to handle it the way I did instead of the other way. And you need to understand Patricia, because everything I did, every move I made over those 8 weeks, every decision I made in that house on Christmas Eve, it all came back to her. 30 years as a cop taught me that the guilty always make the first move. 8 weeks ago, they made theirs, and I was ready. The phone call came on a Wednesday morning in late October, which is about as gray and unforgiving as Chicago gets before it tips over into full winter. I was in the kitchen drinking my second cup of coffee and reading the Tribune the way I'd read it every morning for 30 years, back to front, sports first, because life is too short to start with bad news. The radiator was ticking the way it always ticked in October when the heat first came on, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and the faint ghost of Patricia's lavender soap that I still couldn't bring myself to move from the shelf above the sink, even 2 years on. Some things you leave where they are, not because you're stuck, because moving them feels like agreeing to something you're not ready to agree to. The phone showed Ryan's name. I looked at it for a moment before I answered. That's not something I used to do. Before Patricia died, before the last 2 years of watching my son drift in a direction I couldn't quite name, but recognized the way you recognize weather coming in off the lake, I would have picked up on the first ring without a second thought. But I had learned to take that extra moment, to settle myself, to put the part of me that was just his father in the back seat, and let the part of me that had spent 30 years reading people take the wheel. Hey, Dad. His voice was thin. Not tired exactly. Tight. The way a man's voice gets when he's been rehearsing what he's about to say. Ryan. I kept my voice easy. Warm. How are you doing, son? Good. Yeah. Good. There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long. Listen, I was calling because, well, Cassie and I were talking, and Christmas is coming up, and we thought it might be nice to do something together this year. Like, at your place. I set my coffee cup down quietly. At my place. Yeah, you know, since you've got the space and everything. And Cassie there's a friend of hers, a business associate kind of guy. She thought it might be nice to include him. Make it a real dinner, you know. I looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, at Patricia's garden, gone brown and dormant for the winter. The rose canes she'd cut back herself every November, tied up in their careful bundles along the south fence. A business associate. At my house. At Christmas. In 30 years of interviewing suspects and witnesses and people who were technically neither, but were definitely something, I learned that the most revealing thing a person does is almost never what they say. It's the architecture of how they say it. The pauses. The word choices. The things that get mentioned casually, almost as afterthoughts, that are in fact the entire point of the conversation. Ryan had just told me that Christmas dinner at my house was Cassie's idea, dressed up as a joint decision. He'd introduced a stranger into the invitation and called him a business associate in a tone that didn't want me to ask follow-up questions. And he'd used the phrase, "You've got the space and everything," which was doing a lot of work for a very short sentence. That sounds great. I said, I'd love to have you both, and your friend is welcome too. The more the merrier. The exhale on his end was just slightly too relieved for a man who had simply been hoping his father would agree to a holiday dinner. We said our goodbyes, and I sat with the phone on the table in front of me for a long time after the call ended. The radiator ticked. The Tribune sat unread. Outside, the first dry leaves of the season came off the oak tree in the backyard and skittered across Patricia's dormant garden. I thought about my son. Ryan was 38 years old, and he had his mother's eyes and his mother's instinct for kindness, or at least he'd had it once. He worked in finance, mid-level position at a small investment firm in the Loop that had never quite caught fire the way he'd hoped. He had married Cassie Cole 3 years ago in a ceremony that Patricia had called beautiful and that I had called well-organized, which is the best thing I could honestly say about it. Cassie was sharp and pretty and relentlessly pleasant in the way that some people are pleasant, not because they feel it, but because pleasantness is a useful tool and they've learned to keep it well maintained. I had never been able to put my finger on what bothered me about her. I'd tried. Patricia, who could read a room better than anyone I'd ever known, had said simply, "She doesn't laugh at things that are funny. She laughs at things that are useful." I'd thought about that sentence a lot over the 3 years since. I picked up Patricia's photo from the kitchen counter. She was smiling in it, standing in the back garden in July with dirt on her hands, and the particular expression she got when the dahlias came in right. "They're coming for the house," I told her. "I don't know how yet, but they are, and I'm going to be ready." I put the photo down and picked up my coffee. It had gone cold while I wasn't paying attention. I drank it anyway. It was a Saturday, 3 days after the phone call, when I found it. Ryan had stopped by the house that Friday evening, unannounced, which he almost never did anymore. He said he was in the neighborhood, which was technically possible and practically unlikely, given that Wicker Park, where he and Cassie lived, was a solid 20-minute drive from Lincoln Park on a good day. He stayed for about 40 minutes, drank a beer, talked about nothing in particular, with the slightly distracted energy of a man whose mind was somewhere else entirely, and left his jacket on the hook by the back door when he went. The way he used to when he was a teenager, and the back door hook was just part of the geography of the house. I noticed the jacket after he'd gone. I figured he'd come back for it or I'd drop it by his place. I hung it on the chair in the laundry room and forgot about it until the next morning. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be clear about that. I was checking the pockets before I put the jacket through the wash, the way you do, looking for loose change or a phone or one of the earbuds Ryan was always losing. The inside left pocket had a folded piece of paper in it. I pulled it out without thinking much about it, unfolded it, and read it standing there in the laundry room in my socks, with the washer running and the fluorescent light buzzing overhead. It took me about 15 seconds to understand what I was looking at. It took me another 30 to understand what it meant. The paper was a handwritten summary, 2/3 of a page, in handwriting I didn't recognize. It outlined a property transfer framework. That was the phrase used, property transfer framework, which is the kind of language that sounds technical and neutral and means something specific and ugly when you've spent 8 years prosecuting financial crimes. The framework described a scenario in which an elderly homeowner, described only as the principal, would be encouraged to sign over power of attorney to a designated representative, described as the managing party, who would then facilitate the voluntary transfer of the principal's primary residence into a holding structure for estate planning purposes. There was a name at the bottom of the page, not Ryan's name, not Cassie's name, a name I had never seen before, Victor Shade. Below the name was a phone number with a Chicago area code and 2 lines in a different ink, added later, that read, "Principal confirmed. Timeline Christmas." Below that, in handwriting that I recognized as Cassie's from the birthday card she'd sent me the previous year, 3 words. "He won't resist. I stood in the laundry room for a long time after I read that. The washer went through its cycle. The fluorescent light buzzed. I folded the paper carefully along its original creases and put it in my shirt pocket. Then I went upstairs to my office, sat down at my desk, and opened my laptop. I still had access to databases that a fully retired civilian technically shouldn't have. But that 30 years on the force and 8 years running a specialized unit and a certain number of favors carefully accumulated and never wasted will get you if you know where to knock. I typed in the name Victor Shade and started reading. It took me about 2 hours to build a preliminary picture. And by the end of those 2 hours, I was no longer a father sitting in his home office on a Saturday morning. I was a detective working a case. The shift happened the way it always happened, quietly and completely, like a gear engaging. Victor Shade was 51 years old and operated a real estate consulting firm called Shade Asset Solutions, with an office address on Michigan Avenue that I already knew was the kind of address you rent by the hour to impress clients. He had no criminal record. He had no civil judgments against him. On paper, he was exactly what his business card presumably said he was: a legitimate financial consultant with a clean history and a professional website and a LinkedIn profile full of recommendations from people I'd never heard of. But I had spent 8 years learning that the absence of a record is not the same thing as the absence of a crime. Sometimes it just means someone is good at what they do. I started pulling property records. Cook County, DuPage, Lake. I cross-referenced Shade Asset Solutions against transfer deeds filed in the last 6 years. What I found was a pattern so clean and so consistent that it almost had a signature. 14 properties. 14 elderly homeowners. All widowed or recently widowed. All living alone in high-value homes. 14 property transfers that had gone through without a single complaint filed, without a single police report, without a single court challenge. 14 families who had either not realized what had happened to them, or had realized too late, or had simply not known where to turn. 14. I sat back in my chair and looked at the number on my screen for a long moment. Then I picked up my phone and called Lou Mancini. Lou picked up on the second ring the way he always did, with the particular tone of a man who has been a detective for 26 years and has long since stopped being surprised by anything. Frank. What did you find? I almost smiled. I hadn't said a word yet. I said, Lou, I need you to pull a file for me. The name is Victor Shade. S-H-A-D-E. And Lou, do it quietly. There was a pause on his end. How quietly? The kind where you don't write it down yet. I said, I'll explain when I see you. Lou Mancini had been working out of the District 3 headquarters on Belmont for 26 years, which meant he had an office that looked exactly like you'd expect an office to look after 26 years of continuous occupation by a man who never threw anything away and didn't believe in filing systems. Stacked folders on every flat surface. A whiteboard covered in writing that hadn't been fully erased in what appeared to be several administrations. A coffee maker on the windowsill that was older than some of the junior detectives in the building and made coffee that tasted like it knew things about you. I had worked out of that building for 11 of my 30 years. Walking back into it always felt the same way, like putting on a coat you hadn't worn in a while and finding that it still fit perfectly and that you'd forgotten how much you missed the weight of it. Lou was at his desk when I came in. He was a big man. Lou, broad through the shoulders, with a gray mustache. He'd been growing since the 90s, and the kind of face that had settled into permanent mild skepticism sometime around his 40th birthday, and stayed there. He looked up when I walked in, pushed a folder across the desk toward me without a word, and picked up his coffee. I sat down and opened the folder. What Lou had pulled was considerably thicker than what I'd assembled from public records the day before. Internal reports, cross-referenced case numbers from 3 different jurisdictions, a financial forensics summary that one of the unit's analysts had apparently put together 18 months ago, and then, from what I could tell, quietly shelved. I read through it without speaking. Lou drank his coffee and waited. That was one of the things I had always appreciated about Lou Mancini. He understood that reading was not a social activity. The picture that assembled itself from those pages was both more sophisticated and more straightforward than I had initially assessed. Victor Shade didn't operate alone, and he didn't operate impulsively. He was methodical in the way that people are methodical when they've done something enough times to have refined it into a process. He identified targets through a network of intermediaries, people positioned in professions that gave them access to vulnerable elderly homeowners, estate attorneys, senior care advisors, and, in at least 3 documented instances over the previous 4 years, real estate professionals with access to property valuations and ownership records. I looked up from the folder. 3 instances. Lou nodded without me having to ask the question. His eyes were steady above the coffee cup. I looked back down at the pages. The 3 instances were documented only partially, enough to establish a pattern, but not enough to prosecute. In each case, the intermediary had identified a target, cultivated a relationship over several months through a family member, and then introduced Shade at a carefully chosen moment when the target was isolated and the family member could be used as leverage or as a conduit. In each case, the property transfer had been completed within 60 days of Shade's introduction. In each case, the intermediary had received a payment routed through a series of shell accounts in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. In each case, the intermediary was a woman. I turned to the last page of the financial forensics summary. There was a photograph, pulled from a LinkedIn profile. The woman in the photograph was in her mid-30s, dark-haired, pleasant-looking, with the kind of professional smile that was designed to project competence and approachability in equal measure. Below the photograph was a name, Cassandra Cole, licensed real estate broker, Chicago metropolitan area, current known associate of Victor Shade Asset Solutions. I closed the folder and put it on Lou's desk. Outside the window, a city bus went by on Belmont, and the building shook the way it always shook when the number 77 went past. She's been doing this for at least 4 years, I said. At least, Lou said. That's what we can document. The analyst who built that summary thinks there are 2 earlier instances we can't tie to paper yet. I looked at my hands on the desk for a moment. My son has been married to her for 3 years. Lou nodded. He didn't offer anything sympathetic, which I appreciated. Sympathy wasn't what I needed from Lou, and he knew it. She found him, I said. She didn't fall for him. She found him. She ran a search, identified me as a potential target through property records, and then she found my son, and she worked her way in through him. That's what the pattern suggests, Lou said carefully. I thought about Ryan on the phone 3 days ago, the tightness in his voice, the rehearsed quality of the invitation. I thought about the 3 years of holidays and dinners, and the particular distance that had grown between my son and me in that time. The distance I had attributed to grief and to the ordinary drift that happens between fathers and adult sons, and that I now understood had been carefully and deliberately cultivated by a woman who needed Ryan available as a tool and unavailable as an ally, she's been working him for 3 years, I said, getting him away from me, making sure that when the time came, I'd be isolated enough that using him as the point of contact would make sense. Lou set down his coffee. Frank. He said my name the way he always said it when he was about to ask me something he already knew the answer to. What do you want to do? I picked up the folder and tucked it under my arm. I want to do this right, I said. I want it clean, and I want it complete, and I want it to hold up in a federal courtroom without a single loose thread. I stood up. And Lou, I said, I need you to find out everything you can about what he has on Ryan. Because I don't think my son is doing this because he wants to. I think he's doing this because he doesn't see any other way out." Lou looked at me for a long moment. "You still protecting that kid even now?" I picked up my coat from the back of the chair. "He's my son," I said. "That doesn't have an expiration date." I walked out of the building and into the gray October morning and stood on the sidewalk in front of District 3 for a moment, the folder under my arm and the city moving around me the way it always moved, indifferent and relentless, and not particularly interested in any one man's problems. I wasn't just a father trying to protect his house anymore. I was Exhibit 15, and I had absolutely no intention of making it that easy for them. The apartment building where Ryan and Cassie lived was a converted 6-flat on Hoyne Avenue in Wicker Park, the kind of building that had been a working-class rental property for 60 years before the neighborhood turned and was now a condominium association with a waiting list and a monthly assessment that would have seemed like a joke to the people who originally built it. Ryan and Cassie owned the top-floor unit. I knew the building well enough. I had helped Ryan move in 3 years ago, carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs on a Saturday in August, while Cassie supervised the arrangement of furniture with the focused intensity of someone conducting a military operation. I parked on Hoyne 2 buildings north on a Tuesday morning, 10 days after my meeting with Lou, and I sat in my car, and I watched. I wasn't proud of it. I want to say that plainly. Sitting in a car watching your own son's building is not something any father wants to find himself doing. It sits wrong regardless of the reason. But I had spent 30 years in a profession that required me to set aside what I wanted to be true in favor of what the evidence indicated was true. And the evidence indicated that I needed to see Ryan with my own eyes before I made any decisions about how to proceed. Lou had pulled Ryan's financial records through channels that I won't specify, and what he'd found had given me a theory. I needed to test the theory against reality. Ryan came out of the building at 8:17 in the morning. He was dressed for work. Dark coat. The gray scarf Patricia had given him 2 Christmases before she died. He walked to the end of the block and stood at the bus stop with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders up around his ears, in the way that people stand at Chicago bus stops in October, hunched against a cold that isn't quite winter yet, but is already making its intentions clear. He was looking at his phone. After a moment, he put it in his pocket and looked up the street for the bus, and I watched his face in profile from 50 yards away, and I saw what I had been afraid I was going to see. My son was terrified, not anxious. Not stressed in the ordinary way that a man is stressed when work is difficult, or money is tight, or a marriage is going through a rough patch. Terrified. It was in the set of his jaw and the way his eyes moved, scanning the street with the particular vigilance of someone who has learned to be watchful in a way that exhausts them. It was in the way he checked his phone again, and then put it away again, and then checked it a 3rd time in the space of 2 minutes. It was in the way he startled when the bus arrived, his whole body flinching at the sound of the air brakes before he recognized what it was and made himself relax. I had interviewed enough frightened people in my career to know the difference between a man who was scared of getting caught and a man who was scared of something that had already caught him. Ryan looked like the second kind. I spent the next 4 days building the complete picture, working with Lou and with a financial forensics contact I still had from my time running the crimes unit. A woman named Diane Park, who was now in private practice and who owed me a favor from a case we'd worked together in 2011 that I had never previously called in. What the 3 of us assembled over those 4 days was both more straightforward and more devastating than I had allowed myself to expect. Cassie had started building the trap 2 years before she ever brought Victor Shade into the picture. She had done it carefully, and she had done it well. Ryan worked in finance, which meant he had access to client accounts and to trading platforms and to the kind of institutional infrastructure that, if you knew what you were doing, could be made to look like it had been used for things it hadn't been used for. Cassie knew what she was doing. Over the course of 14 months, she had constructed a paper trail that, viewed from the outside, told a coherent and damning story about Ryan Callahan moving client funds through unauthorized channels for personal gain. The amounts were not enormous, a total of just under $80,000 across 11 transactions. But they were specific enough and documented enough that if that paper trail were submitted to Ryan's firm or to the SEC, Ryan's career would be over and his freedom would be in serious jeopardy. The paper trail was entirely fabricated. Diane Park identified 7 distinct technical anomalies in the documentation within the first 3 hours of analysis, the kind of anomalies that a forensic accountant would catch immediately and that were invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for them. But Ryan didn't have a forensic accountant. Ryan had a wife who had shown him the documents 18 months ago and told him quietly and without particular emotion that she needed him to do exactly what she said from that point forward, and that if he didn't, she would make one phone call, and his life, as he knew it, would be over. She had been controlling him completely for a year and a half. I sat in my car on Hoyne Avenue on a Friday evening and watched the light in the top floor windows of their building and thought about my son up there, 38 years old, living inside a trap that had been built around him so carefully and over such a long period of time that he probably couldn't see the walls anymore. He couldn't come to me. She would have made that clear from the beginning. She had spent 3 years separating him from me, precisely so that when the trap closed, I would be the last person he could turn to. My son wasn't a villain. He was a hostage. And she had been building that cage around him, one bar at a time, for 2 years before I ever found that piece of paper in his jacket pocket. I drove home from Wicker Park on a Friday night with the city doing what Chicago does on Friday nights in October, loud and bright and completely indifferent to any one man's private catastrophe. I took the long way back, up through Lincoln Avenue and across Fullerton, not because the traffic was better, but because I needed the time. 30 years on the force had taught me that the moments between learning something and deciding what to do about it were not moments to rush. Rushed decisions in this business were how cases fell apart. They were how innocent people got hurt and guilty people walked. I had learned to use the drive home the way other men used a drink, to let the information settle, to let the shape of it become clear before I started making moves. By the time I pulled into the garage on Lincoln Park, I knew 3 things with certainty. I knew that Cassie Cole wasn't going to stop. I knew that approaching Ryan directly was not an option. Not yet. Not while she still held that fabricated paper trail over his head like a guillotine. And I knew that whatever I did next, I had exactly one chance to do it right. Victor Shade had walked away clean from 14 families. He was not going to walk away from a 15th. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet on Friday nights when you live alone. A specific and total quiet that you either make your peace with or you don't. I had made a version of my peace with it, but it was the kind of peace that requires daily maintenance and that can come apart without warning on certain evenings when the light is a particular way or the radiator makes a sound that Patricia used to make a joke about. I hung my coat on the hook by the back door and stood in the kitchen for a moment without turning on the overhead light. Just the small light above the stove that we had always left on at night. The one Patricia called the night light, even though we were both 60 years old and neither of us was afraid of the dark. I poured 2 fingers of bourbon and took it to the living room and sat in the chair across from the fireplace. The one that faced the mantel where Patricia's photograph sat between the candlesticks her mother had left her. It was the photograph from the garden, the July one with the dahlias and the dirt on her hands. I had considered moving it to the bedroom after she died, somewhere more private. But I had decided in the end that she belonged in the room where the life of the house happened, not tucked away somewhere quiet. Patricia had never been the tucked-away type. I looked at the photograph for a long time. Here is what I wanted to do. I wanted to call Ryan. I wanted to drive to Wicker Park and knock on that door and sit down with my son and tell him that I knew everything, that the paper trail was fabricated, that Diane Park had already identified 7 anomalies that would dismantle it completely in front of any competent forensic examiner, that he was not trapped the way he thought he was trapped. I wanted to tell him that I had been a detective for 30 years, and that his father was not going to let this stand, and that all he had to do was talk to me. That was what I wanted to do. What I knew I could not do was exactly that, because if I called Ryan, Cassie would know within the hour. She had been managing him for a year and a half. She knew how to read him the way you learn to read a system you've been operating long enough. Every signal, every tell. The moment Ryan knew that I knew, his face would change. And she would see it change. And she would move. She would accelerate the timeline. She would take whatever leverage she had and use it before I had the infrastructure in place to stop her. She might destroy evidence. She might move Ryan out of reach. She might go directly to Shade and push the whole operation forward before Christmas. Before I was ready. Before Lou had the pieces in position. Worst of all, she might hurt Ryan in a way I couldn't fix before I had the means to protect him. I was not willing to risk that. Not for the comfort of a phone call. Not even for the look on my son's face when he found out he wasn't alone. I looked at Patricia's photograph, and I thought about the conversations we used to have in this room. The late ones after Ryan was in bed. The ones where we talked about the cases I was working, and she would listen with the particular quality of attention she had that made you feel like the most important person in the world. Not because she was performing attention, but because she was genuinely, completely interested in whatever you had to say. She had always understood the work better than almost anyone outside of it. She had a mind for patterns, and for people, and for the long game. I think I know what you'd say. I told her. I said it out loud. The way I had started doing in the months after she died. Not because I believed she could hear me, but because the alternative was sitting in silence. And the silence on certain Friday evenings was simply too large for one man to occupy alone. You'd say, do it right. You'd say, one chance. Do it right. The photograph didn't answer. It never did. But the room felt slightly less empty for a moment, the way it sometimes did. And I took that for what it was worth. I finished the bourbon and put the glass on the table and sat in the dark for a while longer, turning the shape of the problem over in my mind, the way I had turned over problems for 30 years. By the time I got up and went to bed, it was past midnight, and the outline of what I needed to do was clear. It would take 6 weeks. It would require precision and patience, and the willingness to let people I loved remain in danger for a defined period of time, in order to guarantee their safety permanently. It was the hardest kind of decision this work ever required. I had 6 weeks to build the perfect trap, and the first thing I needed to do was make sure my son would walk out of it a free man. Margaret Okafor had been practicing estate law in Chicago for 22 years, and her office on LaSalle Street had the particular quality of a place where serious things were handled seriously. Not flashy, not designed to impress. Just good wood furniture and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and the kind of organized quiet that told you the person behind the desk had seen enough chaos in other people's lives to have decided that her own professional environment would not contribute to it. I had used Margaret for Patricia's estate and for my own will, and in that process, I had come to understand that she was one of those rare lawyers who listened more than she talked, and who, when she did talk, said exactly what she meant. I laid everything out for her on a Monday morning 3 days after my Friday night in the living room, with the bourbon and Patricia's photograph. I told her about Victor Shade. I told her about Cassie. I told her about the fabricated paper trail, and about Ryan, and about what I believed they were planning to do on Christmas Eve. I put the folded piece of paper from Ryan's jacket on her desk, and I let her read it. She read it twice without speaking. Then she set it down and looked at me. "What do you need?" she said. Not "what are you planning?" Not "are you sure about this?" Just "what do you need?" That was Margaret. "I need the house to not be mine," I said. "On paper. Legally and completely. I need it transferred into an irrevocable trust structured in such a way that even if someone obtained my signature on a power of attorney document tonight, there would be nothing for that power of attorney to act upon. The house needs to be unreachable." She nodded slowly. "That's doable. It takes a specific structure. An irrevocable trust with a named trustee and defined terms. Once assets are transferred in, they can't be pulled back out by the grantor unilaterally. It's a permanent move." "I understand that." She looked at me steadily. "You're sure? Patricia built that house with me for 30 years. I said, "I am absolutely sure." Margaret spent the next 2 hours walking me through the architecture of what would become the Patricia Callahan Irrevocable Trust. The house, my primary financial accounts, and my investment portfolio would all be transferred into the trust. Margaret herself would serve as trustee. The terms were specific and detailed. I would retain full rights to live in and occupy the property for the remainder of my natural life. The assets could not be sold, transferred, or encumbered by anyone, including me, without Margaret's authorization as trustee, and without meeting a series of conditions that we defined carefully and that I will not detail here, except to say that they were thorough. The beneficiary terms we left for a separate conversation, one I was not quite ready to have yet, but knew I would need to have before Christmas. We filed the paperwork that afternoon. Walking out of Margaret's office onto LaSalle Street with the trust documents in my briefcase, I felt something that I hadn't felt in the 8 weeks since I'd found that piece of paper in Ryan's jacket. I felt the ground under my feet become solid again. Whatever happened on Christmas Eve, the house was Patricia's now in every legal sense that mattered, and no signature I put on any document in any state of mind would be able to change that. The next step was the decoy. I opened a savings account at a branch of the bank I had used for 30 years, on Clark Street, with a balance of $12,000. Modest. Real. The kind of account a retired city employee on a pension might have. The kind that looked exactly like the entire extent of a man's liquid assets, if you didn't know to look anywhere else. I set it up with a paper statement option, and I made sure the account number was on a document I left visible on my desk at home on a Tuesday, when Ryan stopped by to drop off a book he'd borrowed. I didn't point it out. I just made sure it was there to be seen. The following Saturday, I ran into Ryan at the coffee shop on Armitage that we had been going to separately and occasionally together for 15 years. It was not an accident. I had known he went there on Saturday mornings, and I had timed my arrival accordingly. We had coffee together for 45 minutes, and I was careful to be exactly what I had always been with him: warm and present and interested in his life, giving him no indication of anything other than an ordinary Saturday morning with his father. Before we left, I mentioned, in the context of a longer conversation about the house and what it might be worth in the current market, that I had been thinking about doing some reorganizing of my finances, and that I was keeping the bulk of my savings in cash in the house for the time being, in the safe in my office, because I didn't trust the market, and I was old-fashioned about these things. Ryan's face was careful when I said it. Too careful. The kind of careful that is itself a tell. the effort of a man controlling a reaction he doesn't want you to see. I finished my coffee and said goodbye and walked back to my car on Armitage and sat for a moment before I started the engine. I didn't feel good about what I'd just done. Using your son as a conduit, even a son who doesn't know he's being used, and even in service of protecting him, is not something that sits well, regardless of the necessity. But I had learned a long time ago that the discomfort of doing something necessary was not a reason to avoid doing it. It was just the price of doing it. My phone buzzed 48 hours later. It was Lou. "She took the bait," he said. "Shade called Ryan yesterday morning. I've got the call on record. They've confirmed Christmas Eve." I put the phone down on the kitchen counter and looked out at Patricia's garden. The rose canes along the south fence were tied up in their winter bundles, patient and dormant and waiting for spring. She took the bait within 48 hours. Victor Shade called Ryan the next morning. I know, because I was listening. Lou came by the house on a Thursday evening 2 weeks before Christmas, arriving in an unmarked car and carrying a black duffel bag that he set on the kitchen table without ceremony. He had with him a technician from the department, a young woman named Torres, who had the focused, unhurried manner of someone who was very good at a specific thing and didn't need to announce it. They worked through the house for 3 hours, while I sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and stayed out of their way, which was the most useful thing I could do, and also the hardest. Torres installed 4 cameras in total, 1 in the living room, positioned inside the housing of the old mantel clock that had been on the fireplace shelf since Patricia's parents gave it to us as a wedding present. 1 in the dining room, set into the frame of the landscape painting above the sideboard, the one Patricia had bought at a street fair in Old Town 20 years ago, and that I had always thought was just slightly too large for the wall, but had never said so. 1 in the hallway outside my office on the 2nd floor, and 1 in the office itself, built into the spine of a book on the middle shelf of the bookcase behind my desk, a copy of a John le Carré novel that Patricia had given me one birthday, and that I had read twice, and that was now doing considerably more work than its author had intended. Each camera fed to a secure encrypted server that Lou's contact at the FBI field office on Roosevelt Road had set up and was monitoring. Every frame recorded, time-stamped, and stored in a location that had nothing to do with my house or my devices, and that could be accessed and authenticated in a federal courtroom without a single link in the chain of custody being challenged. The microphone was my idea. Patricia had kept an anniversary clock on the mantel in the dining room for as long as I could remember, a brass anniversary clock with a glass dome and a rotating pendulum that she wound every 6 months, and that had marked time in that room through 30 years of dinners and arguments and celebrations and ordinary Tuesday evenings. Torres fitted a high-fidelity directional microphone into the base of the clock in under 4 minutes. It picked up conversation from anywhere in the dining room and transmitted on the same encrypted channel as the cameras. When they were done, Torres walked me through the system on a tablet, showing me the feeds from each camera in real time. The house looked exactly as it always looked. Nothing was visible. Nothing was out of place. It looked like a home, which it was. And it looked exactly like what Victor Shade and Cassie Cole expected to walk into, which was an old man's house full of old man's things, and not a single indication that the old man in question had spent 30 years learning exactly how people like them operated. "Good work," I told Torres. She nodded once and packed her bag and left. That was Torres. Lou stayed for a cup of coffee after she went. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, and we talked through the final logistics. His contact at the FBI field office, a special agent named Kowalski, who had been working financial crimes at the federal level for 12 years, had reviewed the documentation on Victor Shade and had confirmed that what we had was sufficient to support federal charges on at least 3 counts. Kowalski and one other agent would be positioned outside the house on Christmas Eve, in an unmarked vehicle on the street, available to come in on Lou's signal. The plan was simple in the way that the best plans are simple. Let them come. Let them make their move. Get it on camera and on audio with witnesses positioned and ready. Then close the door. I made the call to Ryan the following Saturday morning, 8 days before Christmas. I used the kitchen phone, the landline that Patricia had insisted on keeping, even when everyone else had stopped having landlines, on the grounds that cell phones dropped calls at the worst possible moments, and a landline never did. I had always thought she was being old-fashioned about it. I had kept the landline after she died. Ryan answered on the third ring. He sounded tired in the specific way he had sounded tired for the past several months, a bone-level exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. "Hey, Dad. Hey. Son." I kept my voice easy, the way I had kept it easy on every call for the past 6 weeks, warm and unhurried and completely ordinary. "Listen, I've been thinking about Christmas. I'd like to do it here this year. You and Cassie. And I understand she has a friend she might want to bring along. I'd like to have everyone over. Do it right. I've got Patricia's recipes somewhere, and I think it's time I tried the roast beef again." There was a pause. A short one. But that sounds really good. "Dad. I'll talk to Cassie." In the background, I heard Cassie's voice. Not the words, just the tone. A question. Ryan covered the phone for a moment and then came back. "Actually, yeah. She says that works great. Christmas Eve, if that's okay. She's already thinking about what to bring." She said yes before Ryan even finished the sentence. I hung up and looked out the kitchen window at the snow that had been coming down since morning, soft and steady, settling onto Patricia's garden and the roof of the back porch and the tops of the rose canes tied up along the south fence. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for Christmas. Christmas Eve morning came in gray and cold and completely still, the way the best Chicago winter mornings come in, with a low sky the color of old pewter and snow on the ground from the night before that hadn't been touched yet, smooth and unbroken across the backyard and along the tops of the fence posts and on the roof of the back porch where Patricia had always hung a wreath in December, the nail still there in the wood, even though I hadn't put a wreath on it in 2 years. I was up at 6. I hadn't slept well, which I had expected. In 30 years of police work, I had never slept well the night before, something significant, and I had long since stopped trying to fight it. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window for a while in the dark, watching the snow in the backyard go from black to gray to white as the sky slowly lightened. And I thought about the day ahead with the particular quality of focus that comes when you have done everything you can do, and all that remains is to let it happen. I had decided to cook. It was not a practical decision in any meaningful sense. There would be no appetite in that house that evening, not for food, not from anyone at that table. But Patricia had cooked on Christmas Eve every year for 30 years, starting with the roast beef and working her way through mashed potatoes and green beans and the apple pie that she made from a recipe her grandmother had written out by hand on an index card that was now taped to the inside of the cabinet above the stove. The handwriting faded to nearly nothing, and the card itself soft with age and cooking steam. I had read that card approximately 10,000 times over 30 years, and I knew the recipe by heart. But I left the card where it was. I pulled the roast out of the refrigerator at 6:30 and started the prep work, the way Patricia had always started it early. Low and slow, giving the meat the full day it needed. I found the good roasting pan in the cabinet under the island, the heavy one with the handles that Patricia had bought at a restaurant supply store on Elston Avenue, sometime in the 90s, and that weighed about as much as a small engine block and made everything cooked in it taste like it had been made by someone who knew what they were doing. I seasoned the roast the way she had seasoned it, garlic and rosemary and a heavier hand with the black pepper than most people would use, and I put it in the oven and set the temperature and washed my hands at the kitchen sink. The kitchen filled with the smell of it within the hour. I thought about the Christmases when Ryan was small, when he would come downstairs in his pajamas at an unreasonable hour and find Patricia already in the kitchen with the oven going and the coffee made and Christmas music playing on the radio on the counter. The old radio with the broken antenna that only got 2 stations clearly, but one of them played Christmas music from Thanksgiving through New Year's, and that was enough. Ryan would sit at the kitchen table and eat cereal and watch his mother cook and ask questions about everything. The way small children ask questions, not because they need the answers, but because the asking is its own kind of participation. Patricia had always answered every question completely and seriously, as though the question of why you put garlic on a roast was a question worth treating with full attention. It was one of the things I had loved most about her. I checked the camera feeds at 9 in the morning, then again at 11. Using the tablet Torres had left me with a passcode and a set of instructions written in the kind of plain language that suggested Torres had explained technical systems to non-technical people before and had learned to leave nothing to interpretation. All 4 feeds were clean. The audio from the dining room clock was recording. Everything was green. Lou called at noon. "We're in position," he said. "Kowalski and his partner are in the blue Chevy on Fullerton, 2 houses west. I'm in my car on Orchard. We've got eyes on the front and back." His voice had the particular flatness it got when he was working. All the warmth of ordinary conversation set aside in favor of pure function. "You doing all right?" "I'm making Patricia's roast beef," I said. There was a brief pause. Lou had eaten that roast beef at this table approximately a dozen times over 30 years. He understood what I meant by it. "Good," he said simply. The apple pie went into the oven at 2 in the afternoon, next to the roast, and the kitchen smelled the way it was supposed to smell, the way it had smelled on this day every year for 3 decades. Warm and specific, and full of the particular comfort of a thing done the same way enough times that it becomes its own kind of language. I set the dining room table with the good china, the set Patricia had inherited from her mother that lived in the sideboard and came out only for occasions that merited it. I put candles on the table. I filled the water glasses. I folded the napkins the way she had always folded them, into thirds and then in half. Nothing elaborate, just neat. At 5 o'clock, I stood at the front window in the living room and looked out at Lincoln Park in the early dark of a December afternoon. The street lights coming on one by one along the block. The snow still clean and unbroken on the front walk. The bare branches of the oak tree across the street holding their small loads of white. A car went by slowly. A dog walker came up the sidewalk with 2 dogs, both of them interested in the snow in that wholehearted way dogs are interested in things. Everything was in place. The cameras were running. The recordings were clean. Lou was 2 houses west, and Kowalski was around the corner, and Margaret had her phone on and was ready to receive whatever documentation the evening produced. The trust was filed and locked, and completely beyond the reach of any signature I might produce under any circumstances. I went upstairs and put on the flannel shirt, the green one, with the small tear at the left cuff that Patricia had mended so many times. The thread there was a different shade of green than the rest of the shirt. She had always said it was her favorite shirt on me. I had always suspected she just liked the mending. I was ready. I just hoped my son was too. They arrived at 6 o'clock exactly, which told me something. People who are nervous about being somewhere tend to arrive a few minutes late, because punctuality requires the kind of settled attention that anxiety disrupts. People who are running an operation arrive on time because the timeline is the thing they're controlling, and controlling the timeline is how they manage their nerves. The headlights of Ryan's car swept across the front window at 5:59, and the engine cut off at 6 on the dot. I was at the front door before they reached the porch steps. Ryan came up first, and I looked at my son in the porch light and did what I always did in those 8 weeks. Set aside the part of me that was his father and let the part of me that read people take over. Just for a moment. Just long enough to get a clear picture. He was thinner than the last time I'd seen him. Not dramatically, but enough. His face had the drawn quality of someone who had been running on adrenaline and poor sleep for an extended period, and whose body was beginning to present the invoice. He was carrying a bottle of wine in each hand, and he was holding them slightly too tightly. He met my eyes for a fraction of a second, and then looked at a point just past my left shoulder. "Hey, Dad." His voice was steady. I gave him credit for that. "Ryan." I pulled him in and hugged him the way I always hugged him. One arm around the shoulders, a solid grip, brief. He was stiff in my arms in a way he hadn't been since he was a teenager, and physical affection from a parent had briefly become complicated. "Merry Christmas." "Son." Cassie came up the steps behind him. She was in a dark coat with her hair done carefully, and a smile arranged on her face that was, objectively speaking, a very good smile. Warm. Open. The smile of a woman genuinely pleased to be exactly where she was. If I hadn't spent 6 weeks building a detailed profile of her professional history and methods, I might have found it convincing. "Frank," she said, and kissed me on the cheek with the practiced ease of a daughter-in-law who had been doing it for years. "The house smells incredible. Is that your roast beef?" "Patricia's roast beef," I said pleasantly. I just followed the instructions. And then there was Victor Shade. He came up the porch steps last, which was not an accident. He was taller than I had expected from his photographs, 6 feet at least, and he wore a charcoal overcoat that had been made for him by someone who charged accordingly. He was 51 years old, and he looked like a man who had decided somewhere in his 40s that he was going to look the part of whatever room he was walking into, and had put in the work to make that decision stick. Silver at the temples, a firm handshake, the kind of face that was pleasant without being memorable, which I had come to understand was itself a professional asset. "Frank," he said, as though we were old friends reconnecting. "Victor Shade, Cassie's told me so much about you. Thank you for including me tonight. The more the merrier," I said, and I shook his hand and smiled the smile of a man who was exactly what he appeared to be, an ordinary 65-year-old retired cop happy to have company on Christmas Eve. Behind my eyes, I was doing what I had done in interview rooms for 3 decades, filing everything. The way his eyes moved when he came through the door, not taking in the room the way a guest takes in a room, with social attention, but with the lateral, assessing scan of someone calculating dimensions and value. The way he paused for exactly 2 seconds in the entryway before following Ryan and Cassie into the living room. 2 seconds that I would have bet anything were used to note the exits and confirm the layout matched whatever description Cassie had provided. The way he ran one finger along the edge of the hall table as he passed it, not absent-mindedly, but with the specific attention of a man pricing things. In the living room, I offered drinks and took their coats and moved through the ordinary choreography of hospitality with the unhurried ease of a man who had done this many times and was not thinking about anything in particular. Ryan sat on the couch and held his wine glass with both hands and looked at the fireplace. Cassie moved through the room with a social ease that was, I had to admit, genuinely impressive, asking questions about photographs and complimenting the mantel clock and showing every sign of being a woman completely at home in her father-in-law's living room. Victor stood near the bookcase by the window and made conversation about the neighborhood and the architecture of the brownstones on the block. The kind of conversation that was really an appraisal dressed in small talk. I answered every question. I laughed at the appropriate moments. I refilled glasses and offered appetizers, and I was, to every visible indication, exactly the slightly distracted, warmly hospitable, thoroughly ordinary retired city employee that they had come to this house expecting to find. The dining room clock ticked, the cameras ran, the microphone in the base of the anniversary clock on the sideboard captured every word in the room with a clarity that Torres had assured me would hold up in any courtroom in any jurisdiction. I called them to the table at 6:30. Victor Shade pulled out Cassie's chair for her before sitting down himself. The gesture of a man who understood the value of small performances. He looked at the table, the good china and the candles, and the food that had been cooking since early morning, and he smiled at me across the width of it. "Frank," he said, "this is really something." I smiled back. It was the smile of a man who thought he'd already won. I smiled back. It was the smile of a man who knew he had. The roast beef was, if I'm being honest, as good as Patricia's. Not better. I would never claim better. But it was close enough that when I brought it to the table and set it down, and Ryan looked at it, something moved across his face for a fraction of a second that had nothing to do with the evening's agenda. It was just recognition. The smell of his mother's cooking in his father's house on Christmas Eve. The same smell from every Christmas of his childhood. And for that fraction of a second, he was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere before all of this. And his face was open in a way it hadn't been all evening. Then Cassie said something to him quietly and he came back. We ate, or 3 of us ate. And Ryan moved food around his plate with the focused application of a man trying to look like he was eating without actually managing it. His mashed potatoes sat largely undisturbed. He cut the same piece of roast beef 3 times without bringing any of it to his mouth. His wine glass was full. I noticed all of this the way I noticed everything at that table, cataloging it without reacting to it, filing it away. Cassie opened the conversation the way I had expected her to open it, not with the thing she wanted, but with the approach to the thing, the careful groundwork that a person lays when they have done this before and know that the direct route is not the efficient one. She asked about my knee, which I had mentioned in passing at Thanksgiving 2 years ago, and which she had apparently retained. She asked about the doctor I was seeing, whether he was still practicing, whether I was happy with the care I was getting. She was warm about it, concerned, the kind of concerned that is indistinguishable from genuine concern unless you are specifically looking for the angle. I told her the knee was fine, and that Dr. Reeves had retired, and that I was seeing a new fellow over at Northwestern who seemed competent. I said I was getting older, the way men my age say it, without self-pity, but with a kind of practical acknowledgement. And I let a small tiredness into my voice that was not entirely manufactured. I was 65 years old, and I had been running on 4 hours of sleep and 30 years of accumulated professional discipline. The tiredness was real. I just let it be visible in a way I would not ordinarily have allowed. Victor picked up the thread with the practiced ease of a relay runner taking a baton. He asked about the house in the way that someone asks about a house when they are actually asking about the house. Questions dressed as conversation. How long had I been here? What was the neighborhood like these days? Had I done much work on it in recent years? Was it difficult to maintain a property this size on my own? He framed everything with the tone of genuine curiosity. The interested dinner guest asking about his host's life. And he was good at it. He was very good at it. In a different context. In a room where no one was recording anything, and the man across the table didn't have 30 years of professional training in exactly this kind of performance. He might have been good enough. I answered every question the way a man answers questions, when he hasn't thought too carefully about what they add up to. A little slowly, a little warmly. I told him the house needed work in the usual places. I said the upkeep was manageable, but that there were days it felt like a lot for one person. I said I'd been thinking about what the next chapter looked like, the way older men say it when they're not sure what they mean by it, but know that some kind of change is probably coming. Cassie touched her husband's arm lightly at that, the briefest contact, and I caught it in my peripheral vision and noted it without looking at it directly. Ryan had stopped pretending to eat. His fork was resting on the edge of his plate, and he was looking at the table between his hands with the particular stillness of someone who has arrived at a moment they've been dreading for a long time and has discovered that the dread was accurate. Victor refilled my wine glass without being asked, which was the gesture of a man who was comfortable enough in a room to have decided it was already his. He set the bottle down and leaned back in his chair slightly, the body language of a man settling into the part of the evening he'd been waiting for. He looked at me across the candles and the good china and the food that Patricia's recipe had made exactly right. And he smiled the smile of a man about to offer something he was certain would be accepted. "Frank," he said, "I've been thinking about your future, and I think I can help." The dining room clock ticked. The candles burned. The microphone in the base of the anniversary clock on the sideboard captured every syllable with perfect fidelity. Ryan's hands were flat on the table on either side of his plate, completely still, the way hands go still when the body is holding itself together by main force. I looked at Victor shade across my wife's good china on my wife's table, in my wife's house, and I put on the face of a man who was listening carefully and was cautiously, gratefully interested in what came next. It was, I think, the best performance of my life. Victor Shade was good at his pitch. I want to say that plainly and without grudging it, because 30 years of working financial crimes taught me to respect competence, even when it was being applied to something that deserved a federal indictment. He had clearly given this particular presentation many times, in many dining rooms, at many tables belonging to people who were older and alone, and who had spent their lives building something that their bodies were beginning to make increasingly difficult to protect. He had refined it down to its essential elements, the way you refine anything you do repeatedly until all the unnecessary weight is gone and only the load-bearing structure remains. He started with the practical. The house was an asset, he said, a significant one. And like all significant assets, it required active management to preserve its value. Property taxes, maintenance costs, the particular vulnerabilities of a large, older home to the kind of deferred repair that accumulated invisibly until it didn't. He said all of this in the tone of a man sharing useful information with a friend, rather than building a case. And he was specific enough about the details to sound knowledgeable and general enough about the numbers to avoid anything checkable in the moment. Then he moved to the personal. Living alone in a house this size, he said, was both a practical challenge and, he hoped I didn't mind him saying, a potential safety concern. Not because there was anything wrong with me, he was quick to add, but because these things were worth thinking about before they became urgent. He knew how much this house meant to me. Cassie had told him about Patricia, and he said her name with exactly the right weight, just enough to show he understood the significance. Not so much that it felt like he was using it. He was very good. Cassie came in at the right moments, the way a good support player comes in, not to carry the argument but to normalize it, to make the thing being proposed sound like the kind of thing that sensible, caring people agreed on. She talked about peace of mind. She talked about Ryan and her wanting to know that I was taken care of. She reached across the table and put her hand briefly on mine, and said that they just wanted me to be able to enjoy this chapter of my life, without worrying about all the things that were complicated to manage alone. I looked at her hand on mine, and I thought about 14 families. I thought about 14 dining room tables, and 14 versions of this conversation, and 14 people who had sat where I was sitting and had believed. Because Cassie Cole had put her hand on theirs and spoken about peace of mind, that the thing being proposed was in their interest. Ryan said nothing. He was looking at a point on the tablecloth about 6 inches in front of his plate, and his jaw was set in the way that a man's jaw sets when he is holding himself to a course of action through the application of pure will and is not entirely certain the will is going to hold. Victor brought out the documents at 7:15. He did it smoothly, from the inside breast pocket of his jacket, a folded set of papers that he opened and laid on the table to the right of my plate, with the matter-of-fact ease of a man producing something that was entirely expected and entirely routine. It was a property management authorization framework, he said. Standard language. His firm used it with all their clients. It gave his company the authority to act on my behalf in matters relating to the property and to my associated financial accounts, to ensure continuity of management in the event that I was unable to attend to these matters myself for any reason. He slid a pen across the table toward me. Just your signature on the last page. Frank. Tonight. While we're all together. That way, everything is in order, and we can all enjoy the rest of the holiday knowing it's handled. I looked at the pen. It was a good pen. Heavy and silver. The kind of pen that was chosen to make the act of signing something feel significant and considered rather than rushed. I looked at the papers beside my plate, the careful legal language arranged to look routine and to be anything but. I looked at Cassie, who was watching me with the expression of a woman radiating patient, affectionate encouragement. I looked at Victor, who had the settled confidence of a man who had reached this moment in 14 previous dining rooms and had never once not gotten what he came for. And then I looked at my son. Ryan had lifted his eyes from the tablecloth. He was looking at me directly, for the first time all evening. And what was in his face was not the expression of a man waiting to see if his father would sign away his home. It was the expression of a man who had been carrying something unbearable for a very long time, and who was, in this moment, at the absolute end of his ability to carry it. His eyes were red at the edges. His hands were flat on the table. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something and not knowing whether the thing below him was water or rock. I held his gaze for a moment, just a moment, long enough for him to see that I saw him, long enough for something to pass between us that had nothing to do with the documents on the table or the pen that Victor Shade had slid across the linen. Then I looked back at Victor, and I put down my fork. And I let 30 years of professional discipline do the thing it had been trained to do. All you have to do is sign right here. Frank, Victor said again. His voice was patient, certain. The voice of a man who had already won and was simply waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. I looked at him across the candles and the good china. I looked at him the way I had looked at people across interview room tables for 3 decades. The look that said, I see exactly what you are, and I have seen it many times before, and I am not afraid of it, and I am not going to pretend otherwise for one more second. Then I reached out, picked up the pen, and set it back down on his side of the table. The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. I know because I counted them the way I had learned to count silences in interview rooms. Not to fill them, but to let them do their work. Silence is a tool. Most people can't tolerate it and will say something to end it. And what they say in those unguarded seconds is almost always more useful than anything they said before. Victor Shade lasted 3 of the 4 seconds. Frank. His voice had lost one layer of its warmth. Just one. The outermost layer. The social one. The layer beneath it was still controlled, but it was a different kind of control. The control of a man who is recalculating rather than performing. I don't think you fully understand what we're offering here. This is a straightforward estate planning tool. Standard practice for someone in your situation. My situation, I said pleasantly. And what situation is that? Victor. The second layer went then. Not all of it. But enough. His eyes moved to Cassie for a fraction of a second. The involuntary check of a man looking to his partner when the script has departed from the expected. And then came back to me. Just a man your age, he said. Living alone in a property this size. It's a lot to manage. We're trying to help. I appreciate that. I said. I picked up my fork, took a bite of the roast beef, chewed it, set the fork down. The cameras were running. The microphone in the anniversary clock was capturing everything. I looked at him with the expression of a man who was thinking it over. And then I let the expression change. It was not a dramatic change. I didn't stand up. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stopped performing the role I had been performing all evening, and let him see the face I actually had. The one that had sat across from people in interview rooms for 30 years, and had learned every tell, and every deflection, and every variety of the particular desperation that makes people do things they would not otherwise do. I let him see a man who had known, from the moment he found a piece of paper in his son's jacket pocket on a Saturday morning 8 weeks ago, exactly what this evening was, and exactly how it was going to end. The color shifted in Victor's face. Not dramatically. Just enough. No, I said. The word was quiet. It wasn't angry. It was the kind of no that closes a door permanently, and everyone in the room understands that the door is closed. Cassie moved faster than Victor. That was consistent with what I knew about her, that she was the operational one, that Victor was the closer, but she was the engine. She put both hands flat on the table and leaned forward, and the warmth she had been projecting all evening went out like a light being switched off. Frank, she said, and her voice was a different instrument entirely now, stripped of all its social padding. You need to think carefully about what you're doing. Ryan has a situation, a financial situation. It's serious, and if you don't cooperate tonight, that situation becomes very public very quickly, and there is nothing any of us can do about it. She let that sit for a moment, watching me, waiting for the flinch. I looked at Ryan. He had lifted his head. He was looking at me with the expression I had seen on his face from 50 yards away on a Tuesday morning outside a bus stop on Hoyne Avenue. The expression of a man who had been carrying something unbearable for too long. And what was in his eyes now was not just fear, but something that had moved past fear into a kind of terrible resignation. The look of a man watching something happen that he had been dreading, and that he no longer had the strength to stop. I held his eyes for 2 full seconds. In those 2 seconds, I tried to put into my expression everything I could not say out loud in front of Victor Shade and Cassie Cole, and the cameras that were running, and the microphone that was recording everything. I tried to tell him that I knew, that I had known for 5 weeks, that the thing she was threatening him with was already neutralized, and had been neutralized for 6 weeks, and that he was not in the danger he believed himself to be in, and had not been in that danger for a month and a half. I tried to tell him that I was his father, and that none of what was about to happen was aimed at him, and that he was going to be all right. I don't know how much of it got through, but something did. I could see it in the way his shoulders dropped a fraction, the way a man's shoulders drop when he puts down a weight he's been carrying so long he'd forgotten it wasn't part of him. Then I looked back at Victor. You should have done your homework, I said. My voice was conversational. The tone I used when I was telling someone something they needed to know rather than something I needed them to hear. I didn't just walk a beat in this city for 30 years. I ran the organized financial crimes unit out of District 3 for 8 of them. I have put together federal cases against people considerably more sophisticated than you. I have sat across from men who were much better at this than you are, and I have watched them make the same mistake you are making right now, which is believing that the person across the table from you is what you decided they were before you walked in the door. Victor Shade looked at the camera in the corner of the dining room. It was the landscape painting above the sideboard, the one Patricia had bought at a street fair in Old Town. And he looked at it with the specific attention of a man who had just understood something. He should have understood much earlier. His face went the color of December snow. I gave Victor a moment with what he had just understood. That was deliberate. In 30 years of interrogations and confrontations, and the particular variety of conversation that happens when a case reaches the point where the evidence is on the table and the person across from you knows it, I had learned that the moment of understanding needs space to complete itself. If you move too quickly, you give the other person something to react to, and reaction is unpredictable. If you let the understanding settle, what you get instead is a different thing entirely. You get a person standing in the full weight of their situation. And a person standing in the full weight of their situation is a person who has already begun, however involuntarily, to accept it. Victor Shade stood in the full weight of his situation for approximately 5 seconds. Then he straightened slightly in his chair, and the professional composure came back. Not all of it, but enough. The residual competence of a man who had been in difficult rooms before and who had not survived 14 previous operations by falling apart when things went sideways. He said, carefully, that he wasn't sure what I thought I was looking at in that painting, but that I was making a serious accusation, and that he had every intention of speaking to his attorney before this conversation went any further. I nodded as though this were a perfectly reasonable response, which told him nothing about whether it was going to work, because it wasn't. I laid it out for them the way I had laid out cases in briefings for 30 years, methodically and without drama, starting with the first piece of evidence and moving to each subsequent piece in the order that built the clearest picture. I told them about the piece of paper in Ryan's jacket pocket. I told them about the property records I had pulled in the first 2 hours and the pattern that had emerged from them. 14 properties, 14 widowed homeowners, 14 clean transfers with no complaints filed. I told them about the 3 previous cases in which a female intermediary with a real estate background had been documented receiving payments routed through Delaware and Cayman shell accounts. I told them that the female intermediary in those 3 cases was Cassandra Cole, licensed real estate broker, whose LinkedIn profile photograph I had pulled on a Saturday morning 8 weeks ago, and whose financial records, obtained through channels I did not specify, showed payments totaling just under $230,000 from entities connected to Shade Asset Solutions over the previous 4 years. Cassie had gone very still. Not the stillness of a person processing what they were hearing, the stillness of a person deciding what to do next. The internal calculation visible in the set of her jaw and the quality of her attention. I told them about the fabricated paper trail. I told them that Diane Park, a forensic accountant with 20 years of experience in financial crimes, had identified 7 distinct technical anomalies in the documentation within 3 hours of analysis. I told them that the fabricated evidence had been formally reviewed and documented 6 weeks ago, that Ryan's firm had been notified through appropriate channels, and that the matter had been resolved without any action against Ryan because there was, as a thorough forensic examination had confirmed, no legitimate basis for any action against Ryan. Ryan made a sound, a very small sound, barely audible, the sound of a man hearing something he had been afraid to hope for. I did not look at him. Not yet. Victor pushed his chair back from the table. He did it slowly, the way a man moves when he is trying to make a deliberate movement look casual. And he said, in a voice that was working hard to stay level, that he thought there had been a misunderstanding, and that he was going to step outside and make a phone call, and that he was sure everything could be sorted out. He stood up. I said, "Victor." Just the name. Nothing else. He stopped. "The cameras in this room," I said, "have been recording since 6 o'clock this evening. The audio feed from the microphone in that clock on the sideboard has been transmitting in real time to a secure server managed by the FBI field office on Roosevelt Road. Every word spoken at this table tonight has been recorded, time-stamped, and is currently being monitored by Special Agent Kowalski of the Federal Financial Crimes Division, who has reviewed your file and has confirmed that the evidence already in his possession, combined with what has been said and done in this room tonight, is sufficient to support federal charges on no fewer than 4 counts. I paused to let that number settle. "The documents you placed on my table this evening," I continued, "constitute an additional count of attempted fraud. The verbal threats made against my son's professional standing constitute attempted extortion, and the presence of Cassandra Cole at this table as a documented associate in prior similar operations constitutes evidence of conspiracy." Victor looked at the door. It was a specific look, the look of a man measuring distance and calculating odds, and I recognized it because I had seen it many times before, and I knew exactly what it meant, and I knew exactly what was going to happen next, because I had planned for exactly this. He moved toward the door. I let him go. I wanted him to open it. Victor Shade opened the front door of my house at 7:47 in the evening and found Lou Mancini standing on the porch. Lou was in his overcoat, the dark one he wore in winter, with his badge on his belt and his hands at his sides, and the expression on his face that I had seen him produce in similar circumstances many times over the years. The expression of a man who is not surprised by anything that is currently happening and who has all the time in the world. Behind him, 2 steps back and slightly to his left, stood Special Agent Kowalski, a compact man in his 40s with a gray suit and the particular quality of stillness that federal agents develop after enough years in the field. To Kowalski's right stood his partner, a younger woman whose name I learned later was Agent Reyes, and she was already holding a set of documents that I recognized as the arrest warrants Margaret had helped coordinate through the federal system 3 days prior. The snow was still falling, soft and steady, the way it had been falling all day, settling on Lou's shoulders and on the porch railing and on the front walk and on the bare branches of the oak tree across the street. The porch light caught it as it came down and made it look, for a moment, like the kind of Christmas card that Patricia used to buy in boxes of 20 at the drugstore on Clark Street every November. Victor stopped. He looked at Lou. He looked at the badge. He looked at Agent Reyes and the documents in her hand. And then, because there was nothing else to do with it, he looked back over his shoulder at me. 30 years in the making, I said. Behind me I heard Cassie. She had come to the entrance of the living room, and she made a sound when she saw what was on the porch. Not a scream. Something smaller and sharper than a scream. The sound of a person absorbing a blow they had genuinely not believed was coming. She was very good at what she did, and she had done it successfully for a long time, and I think, until the moment Lou Mancini appeared in that doorway, some part of her had continued to believe that the old man at the dining room table was exactly what he had appeared to be when she had first identified him as a target in a property database 18 months ago. Lou stepped through the door. Kowalski and Reyes followed. The living room felt different with them in it. Denser. The way a room feels when the thing that has been theoretical about it becomes actual. "Victor Shade," Lou said. His voice had the flat, practiced cadence of a man who had said similar things many times. "You are under arrest on federal charges of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, attempted theft by deception, and elder financial abuse. You have the right to remain silent." Victor said nothing. He stood and listened to the rights being read to him with the expression of a man cataloging the situation and calculating his options. And I watched him do it, and I knew what he was finding, which was that there were no options, which was the only outcome I had been willing to accept. Cassie moved. She stepped back toward the dining room, and Lou was already turning, and Reyes was already moving, and it was over in about 4 seconds. Cassie with her hands behind her back, and Reyes explaining the charges in the same flat professional voice that Lou had used. Conspiracy, extortion, elder financial abuse as a primary operative. The charges stacked up like the evidence they were built on, solid and documented and going nowhere. Ryan had not moved. He was standing at the edge of the dining room doorway, one hand on the frame, and he was watching everything with the expression of a man who has been in a burning building for a very long time and has just stepped through a door and found, against all reasonable expectation, that the air on the other side of it is clean. As Reyes turned Cassie toward the front door, Cassie looked at Ryan. She had been working him for 3 years. She knew exactly which lever to pull, and she pulled it one final time, her voice dropping to the register she used when she was managing him, low and certain, and aimed directly at the part of him she had spent 3 years convincing was the most important part. "Ryan," she said, "you know what I have. You know what happens if you let this go forward. Don't do this." Ryan looked at her. He held her gaze for a long moment, and what was in his face was not what she was looking for. It was not fear. It was not the particular variety of exhausted compliance that she had come to rely on over 3 years of careful cultivation. It was something else, something clearer and quieter. The expression of a man who has just been told that the thing he was most afraid of no longer exists, and who is, for perhaps the first time in a very long time, standing on ground that is actually solid. He looked at her for that long moment, and then he turned away. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just turned and looked at me instead. And the look that passed between us in that moment was the first honest thing that had happened in that house all evening. The first thing that had nothing to do with strategy or evidence or the careful architecture of a 6-week operation. It was just a father and his son standing in the same room, and both of them still there. That was the bravest thing I had ever seen Ryan Callahan do. The front door closed at 7:53 in the evening, and the house went quiet in a way that was different from any quiet it had held before. Not the quiet of an empty house, which I had learned intimately over 2 years of living in one. Not the quiet of a house between activities, waiting for something to start. It was the quiet of a house after something has ended. And the ending was so complete and so final that the silence it left behind had a particular texture to it, dense and clean, like the air after a storm has passed and taken everything with it. Ryan was still standing at the edge of the dining room doorway. His hand had dropped from the frame. He was looking at the floor in front of his feet, and his shoulders had the posture of a man who has been holding himself upright through a long, sustained effort, and has, in the last several minutes, been relieved of the necessity of continuing that effort, and has not yet figured out what his body is supposed to do instead. I looked at my son for a moment. 38 years old, thinner than he should be. The gray scarf Patricia had given him still around his neck. The one small thing from before all of this that had made it through the evening intact. "Ryan," I said. He looked up. His eyes were red at the rims, and there was a quality in them that I recognized from the few times in his childhood When something had gone wrong enough to reach him at the level below the surface, he usually kept composed. He was trying to hold it together, and he was not entirely succeeding, and I could see the effort of it in the set of his jaw. I crossed the dining room and pulled out one of the chairs from the table, the one across from where he was standing, and I sat down. Not because I needed to sit, but because I wanted to be at a level that invited him to come closer rather than a level that required him to look up at me. Ryan came into the room slowly and sat in the chair around the corner from mine, not directly across the table, but at the angle you sit at when you are in the same conversation as someone, but not quite ready to be face to face with them. We sat for a moment without speaking. The anniversary clock on the sideboard ticked. Outside, the snow was still coming down. "I want to tell you some things," I said, "and I need you to let me get through all of them before you say anything. Can you do that?" He nodded. "I know what she did to you," I said. "I know about the paper trail. I know she built it over 14 months. I know she showed it to you 18 months ago. And I know that what she told you was that if you didn't do exactly what she said, she would make one call and your career and your freedom would be finished. I know she spent 3 years separating you from the people in your life who might have helped you, including me. I know you have been living inside that for 1.5 years, and I know what that does to a person." Ryan was looking at his hands on the table. His jaw was working. 5 weeks ago, I continued. Diane Park completed a full forensic analysis of that paper trail. She identified 7 distinct anomalies in the first 3 hours. The documentation is fabricated. There is not a single legitimate transaction in it. Diane's report, along with a formal review by a second independent examiner, was submitted to your firm 6 weeks ago. The matter was reviewed and closed. There is no record, no complaint, no ongoing inquiry. You are not under any threat from that paper trail. You haven't been for 6 weeks. Ryan made a sound. It was very small, and it was involuntary, and it was the sound of a man hearing something that his body had been braced against for so long that the removal of it was its own kind of shock. "I didn't come to you," I said, "because she was watching you the way you watch something you own. And the moment you knew that I knew, she would have seen it in your face. She had been reading you for 3 years. I could not risk her accelerating the operation before I had everything in place to stop it completely. I needed her to come here tonight. I needed her to do what she did tonight. And I needed you to be here when it happened, so that there was no version of this story in which you were anything other than what you are, which is the person she used, and the person she lied to, and the person I was protecting from the beginning." Ryan looked up from his hands. His eyes were wet. Not crying. Not quite. But the specific condition that precedes it in a man who has learned to keep that particular gate closed, and who is, in this moment, losing the argument with himself about whether to keep it closed. "I wasn't building a trap for you, son," I said. "I was building a way out for you." He put his face in his hands then, and his shoulders moved, and I got up from my chair and went around the corner of the table and put my hand on his back, between his shoulder blades, the way I used to when he was 8 years old, and the world felt too big for him, and the only thing that helped was knowing that someone who loved him was close enough to reach. We stayed like that for a while. The clock ticked. The snow fell on Lincoln Park. Neither of us said anything for a long time, and nothing needed to be said. And the house held us the way houses hold the people who belong in them, quietly and completely, and without asking anything in return, at some point, without either of us deciding to do it. We moved from the dining room to the living room. I don't remember exactly when. The dining room had been the operational space for the evening. The table and the cameras and the documents and the particular density of everything that had happened there. and I think both of us needed to be somewhere else, without having to explain why. Ryan followed me, or I followed Ryan, and we ended up in the living room in front of the fireplace, which I had laid a fire in that morning, out of habit, and lit before they arrived, and which had burned down to a good steady bed of coals that threw heat into the room without effort. I sat in my chair, the one across from the mantel. Ryan sat on the couch to my left, angled toward the fire. He had his elbows on his knees, and his hands loosely clasped, and he was looking at the coals the way people look at fires, without particular focus, letting the light do whatever it did. The gray scarf was still around his neck. He had not taken his coat off all evening, and he took it off now, quietly, and set it on the cushion beside him. We sat for a while without speaking, and it was a different silence from the one in the dining room. That silence had been the silence of aftermath, of things having just ended. This one was older. It was the silence of two people who had known each other for 38 years and who were finding their way back to the version of that, knowing that existed before everything that had accumulated over the past 3 years had gotten in between them. Ryan spoke first. He said, quietly, "Looking at the fire, tell me about her." I looked at him. He was still watching the coals. He said, "I know about her. I grew up with her, but I feel like I've been..." He paused. "Like I haven't been thinking about her right. Like the version of her I've been carrying around has gotten smaller than it should be, and I want to know about her the way you knew her." I looked at the fire for a moment before I answered. "Your mother," I said, "was the most honest person I have ever known. Not honest the way people mean it when they're describing someone blunt or tactless. Honest in the structural sense. She built her life on what she actually believed and what she actually felt. And there was no gap between those things and what she said and did. I have spent 30 years in a profession that required me to understand why people do what they do. And I can tell you that what your mother had is rarer than anything. It is rarer than intelligence, and rarer than talent, and considerably rarer than money." Ryan was listening with his eyes on the fire. "She loved this house," I said. "Not because of what it was worth or what it represented or what it said about us. She loved it the way you love a thing you built with your hands. Because she had put herself into it. Every room, every choice, every modification and repair and improvement over 30 years. She used to say that a house is just an argument you make with a piece of land. And if the argument is good enough, the land accepts it. I always thought that was the most Patricia thing I had ever heard her say." Ryan almost smiled. It moved across his face and didn't quite make it, but it was close. "She would have known what to do tonight," he said. "Before any of this happened. She would have seen it." "Yes," I said. "She would have seen it the first time Cassie came to dinner." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Dad." He said it simply, without elaboration. The way an apology means something when it isn't qualified by explanation or context. Just those 3 words. And the weight of them was exactly what it should have been. "I know," I said. We sat with that for a while. I looked up at Patricia's photograph on the mantel. The July one, the dahlias, the dirt on her hands, the expression of complete and uncomplicated happiness that she had in that picture and that I had been looking at for 2 years as a kind of fixed point. The thing that stayed constant when everything else moved. The fire had been burning for hours, and the room was warm, and the snow outside was the quiet kind that absorbed sound rather than amplifying it. And the house was entirely still around us. Ryan had followed my gaze to the photograph. We were both looking at it, the two of us, in the warm light of the fire on Christmas Eve. in the house she had loved and argued for and built over 30 years. And that was still, despite everything that had been attempted against it this evening, exactly what it had always been. "Merry Christmas, Pat," I said quietly. "The house is still ours." Beside me on the couch, Ryan reached over and put his hand on my arm. Not a grip, just a weight. The specific contact of a person who wants you to know they are there without requiring anything from you in return. We sat like that for a long time, the two of us, while the fire settled into its coals and the snow kept coming down soft and steady on Lincoln Park. And the house was quiet around us, and everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to be done had been done, and it was enough. The months that followed moved the way justice usually does, slowly. Then, all at once, Margaret Okafor filed the complete forensic package with the U.S. Attorney's Office on the morning of December 26th, less than 10 hours after Special Agent Kowalski walked Victor Shade out of my front door in handcuffs. The package included the audio and video recordings from the 5 hidden cameras, Diane Park's forensic accounting report documenting the fabricated fraud evidence used against Ryan, the original note I had found in Ryan's jacket 8 weeks earlier, Lou Mancini's cross-jurisdiction case file linking Victor Shade to 14 prior victims across 3 states, and a sworn statement from me detailing every step of the 8-week investigation. Margaret had been preparing that filing for 6 weeks. She did not need a single revision. The federal grand jury returned indictments in February. Victor Shade faced 7 counts conspiracy to commit wire fraud, attempted theft by deception, elder financial abuse, 2 counts of extortion, 1 count of obstruction of justice, and 1 count of racketeering under RICO statutes. His attorney, a downtown Chicago firm that billed more per hour than most people earned in a week, filed 3 separate motions to suppress the recordings. The judge denied all 3 within 30 days. The audio and video were clean. The FBI chain of custody was flawless, and the warrants had been properly secured before a single camera was installed. I had spent 30 years making sure evidence held up in court. I was not going to let it fall apart on my own case. Cassandra Cole entered a guilty plea in March. Her attorney negotiated for reduced charges in exchange for full cooperation against Victor Shade. But the cooperation did not earn as much leniency as she had hoped. The fabricated evidence she had built against Ryan over 14 months was the element that hurt her most in sentencing. The judge, a woman with 22 years on the federal bench, read the particulars of what Cassie had done, the carefully constructed paper trail, the false transaction records, the way she had isolated Ryan from his father for nearly 2 years and described it as a sophisticated and premeditated campaign of psychological and financial coercion. Cassandra Cole received 9 years in a federal correctional facility. She would be eligible for parole in 6 years if she maintained good conduct. Victor Shade went to trial in April. He chose to fight every count, which was his right, and his attorneys were skilled. They argued that Frank Callahan, a retired detective with a personal grievance, had engineered an entrapment scenario that contaminated any legitimate business discussion. The argument held together for approximately 40 minutes of cross-examination, at which point the U.S. attorney played 17 minutes of the Christmas Eve audio recording and asked the jury whether the conversation they had just heard sounded like a legitimate business discussion. The jury deliberated for 8 hours across 2 days. They returned guilty verdicts on 6 of the 7 counts. Victor Shade received 14 years in a federal correctional institution with no possibility of parole for the first 10. The racketeering conviction meant his asset management company was dissolved, its accounts frozen, and its records subpoenaed as part of a broader investigation into the 14 prior victims whose cases Lou Mancini had originally compiled. Ryan testified at the Shade trial. He did not have to. His immunity agreement did not require it, but he chose to sit in that witness chair and walk the jury through 22 months of fear, silence, and coercion. He described the morning Cassie had first shown him the fabricated documents. He described the 18 months of believing that a single phone call to his father could destroy everything. He described Christmas Eve, the moment he had watched his wife be arrested, and the 2 seconds when he had turned away from her and toward me. The U.S. attorney told me afterward that Ryan's testimony had been the most effective 20 minutes of the entire trial. I sat in the second row behind the prosecution table for every day of the Shade proceedings. Lou sat beside me on most of those days, and Margaret was at the table itself. On the final afternoon, when the verdict was read, and Victor Shade stood motionless while the clerk listed count after count, I thought about the 14 families who had come before mine. I thought about the elderly woman in Evanston who had signed her house away believing she was protecting her grandson. I thought about the retired schoolteacher in Indianapolis who had died in a care facility 18 months after losing her home, never understanding what had happened to her. Their faces were not in that courtroom, but they were the reason the sentence was 14 years and not 5 after the verdict. Lou walked with me to the parking garage on Clark Street. The afternoon was cold and clear, the way Chicago gets in April when winter finally decides it has made its point. Lou said, "You know you could have just called us in October." I told him I needed 8 weeks to make sure Ryan walked away clean. Lou nodded, and we shook hands. And that was the end of it. Justice, I have learned, does not always arrive on time. But when it is built carefully, brick by brick, over 8 weeks and 30 years of knowing how the system works, it tends to hold. It was a Tuesday in May when I finally told Ryan about the trust. Not because I had been hiding it from him. He knew the house was protected, knew that Margaret had filed paperwork the night after Christmas, knew in a general way that his father had spent 6 weeks building a legal structure designed to make the whole plan work. But the full details of the Patricia Callahan Irrevocable Trust, the specific terms, the beneficiary conditions, the reason I had named it the way I had, those were things I had wanted to tell him in person. When the trial was finished, and the sentences were handed down, and the air between us had cleared enough to breathe something other than courthouse tension, I asked him to meet me at Margaret's office on LaSalle Street. I did not tell him why. I simply said there was something he needed to hear, and that Margaret needed to be there when he heard it. Ryan arrived in a gray suit he had bought recently, one of the first things he had purchased for himself since December, without Cassie's opinion attached to it. He looked better than he had in years. Still thin, still carrying the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from a long period of sustained fear. But there was something behind his eyes that had not been there in a long time. It looked like ground. It looked like the beginning of something stable. Margaret offered coffee. We sat across from each other at her conference table, and she opened the trust document to the first page and slid it across the table to Ryan. He looked at the title, Patricia Callahan Irrevocable Trust, and I watched something move across his face that I did not fully have a word for. Something between grief and recognition. The way a person looks when they encounter an object from a house they grew up in and suddenly remember the exact weight of it in their hands. Margaret walked him through the structure. The Lincoln Park house, appraised in October at $950,000. The investment portfolio, transferred in full. The savings accounts, and the checking account that was not the decoy. Every asset I had owned at the time of filing, placed inside a legal structure that could not be touched by a power of attorney, could not be transferred by a single signature at a dinner table. could not be taken by a man in a good suit who thought an old detective would not know the difference. Then Margaret reached the beneficiary section, and she stopped. And she looked at Ryan, and she said, "Your father named you the sole primary beneficiary of this trust, effective upon his passing or upon his voluntary dissolution of the trust. The condition attached to the bequest is that you maintain financial sobriety and legal standing for a period of 5 consecutive years from the date of this meeting. At the end of that 5-year period, the house and all remaining assets transfer to you in full. There is no other condition." Ryan did not say anything for a long moment. He looked at the page. He looked at me. I told him his mother had chosen that house. I told him she had walked through 11 properties in 6 months before she stood in the Lincoln Park living room and said, without any hesitation, that this was the one. I told him she had planted the rose bushes along the back fence herself. In the spring of the year, Ryan turned 7, and that she had made him help her, and that he had complained about the dirt under his fingernails the entire afternoon. Ryan let out a short sound that was almost a laugh. I told him the trust was not about money. I told him it was about the fact that his mother had believed, from the first day he was born, that he was capable of building something worth keeping. I told him she had never stopped believing that, not once, through every difficulty and every year and every mistake. And neither had I. Ryan looked down at the table. His jaw was tight. When he looked back up, his eyes were wet, and he said, quietly, that he did not understand why I had not given up on him a long time ago. I told him that was not how this family worked. I told him that was never going to be how this family worked. Margaret gave us a moment, which she handled with the kind of professional grace that comes from 2 decades of sitting across from families in complicated rooms. When Ryan had collected himself, he asked if he could keep a copy of the trust document. Margaret said she had already prepared one. He folded it carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of his gray suit, close to his chest. And I thought that was exactly where it belonged. We walked out onto LaSalle Street together in the May afternoon sun. And Ryan said he wanted to take me to lunch. Somewhere good. Somewhere Patricia would have liked. I told him I knew just the place. It was the first meal we had eaten together, without tension, in longer than either of us could properly remember. It tasted like relief. It tasted like something new, beginning. It was the 2nd Saturday of June, when Ryan showed up at the Lincoln Park house with 2 cans of white paint and a set of brushes still in the hardware store bag. I had not asked him to come. He had called the night before and said he wanted to help with the back fence, the one along the rose bushes that had needed repainting since the previous autumn. I told him I had been meaning to get to it. He said he knew, and that he would be there at 9 in the morning. He arrived at 8:53. We worked through the morning without rushing. The June air was warm and clean, the kind of morning that makes Chicago feel like it has been apologizing all winter and has finally gotten around to meaning it. The rose bushes Patricia had planted were in bloom, deep red along the left side of the fence, pale pink near the gate, and the smell of them mixed with the paint smell in a way that should not have worked, but did. Ryan painted the lower sections, crouching with the kind of focused patience that reminded me of how he had been as a boy, careful and deliberate when something actually mattered to him. I painted the upper sections, working slowly, not because I was tired, but because there was no reason to hurry. Around 11 o'clock, Ryan set his brush across the top of the paint can and asked me if I had ever been afraid. Not afraid of Victor Shade. Not afraid of the plan failing, but genuinely afraid. Somewhere in those 8 weeks, that he and I would not find our way back to each other. I thought about the question honestly, the way I had learned to think about hard questions over 30 years of asking them. Then I told him yes. I told him there had been one night in November, sitting in the dark with Patricia's photograph and a glass of bourbon I barely touched, when I had looked at the distance between us and could not see across it. I told him that was the night I decided to build the trap with enough precision that Ryan would come out of it with nothing to apologize for, so that when it was over, there would be nothing standing between us but the truth. I told him I did not think that was courage. I thought it was just what a father does when he does not know what else to do. Ryan picked up his brush again. After a moment, he said that Patricia would have laughed at both of us. I told him she absolutely would have. We kept painting. I have lived long enough to understand that family is not a simple thing. It is not the word itself, and it is not the obligation, and it is not the shared last name on a mailbox. Family is what survives the worst version of events. It is what two people choose to return to when they didn't have to. Ryan did not have to testify at that trial. He did not have to call me the morning after Christmas. He did not have to show up on a Saturday morning in June with paint and brushes and the willingness to spend a quiet day doing something ordinary. He chose every one of those things, and in choosing them, he gave me something I had not known I was still waiting for. Patricia used to say that God places the right people in our lives at the right time, and that our only job is to pay attention. I have not always been good at the paying attention part. I was better at evidence than I was at presence, better at building cases than at building conversations. But I believe she was right. I believe that the 30 years I spent learning how systems work and how people deceive and how evidence holds were not separate from the life I lived at home. I believe they were the same life, and that God gave me both of them for a reason, and that the reason was standing 6 feet to my left, painting the lower half of a fence on a warm June morning. We finished the fence a little past noon. Ryan cleaned the brushes at the outdoor spigot, while I stood back and looked at the whole length of it. White and clean against the red and pink of the roses. It looked the way the house was supposed to look. It looked like Patricia's house. Ryan dried his hands and stood beside me, and we looked at it together for a moment without saying anything. Then he asked if I was hungry. I told him I could eat. We went inside, and I made sandwiches, and we sat at the kitchen table where 6 months earlier, a man in an expensive suit had placed a silver pen and asked me to sign away everything that mattered. The table looked different now. It just looked like a table. If you have someone in your life who has stayed when it would have been easier to leave, tell them today. Do not wait for a Christmas dinner or a courtroom or a fence that needs painting. Just tell them, that is all I have. God bless you, and thank you for spending this time with me.